Hi, and welcome to Cultivating Hope, the Role of Artists in Democracy. This is a part of our virtual International Festival of Arts and Ideas. My name is Elizabeth Nearing. I'm the curator of Ideas Programming. The International Festival of Arts and Ideas is created and produced on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac, in the land we call home, Connecticut. I hope that from wherever you are, you take a moment to acknowledge and honor the Native people whose lands you are on and the history of the place you are in. You can find out more about Native land here or near you at the link that we're going to put in the comments. It's nativeland.ca. This year, our Ideas programming has been created in collaboration with an abundance of thought partners, including our neighbors and organizations here in New Haven and the brilliant panelists here today from us from 4 different time zones. So thank you, everybody, for coming along with us on this journey. We'd love to continue centering your thoughts, your questions, whatever you're curious about, even in the middle of the talk. So throughout, if you have thoughts, ideas, questions, you can type them in the comments below on Facebook or YouTube, and we'll do our best to get to as much of them as we can throughout the conversation. As a part of the Ideas series, this is presented in partnership with Connecticut Humanities with additional major support from the Whitney Center and media support from CT Public. And it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our amazing speakers this afternoon. Welcome playwright Larissa FastHorse, the founder of Theater of the Oppressed NYC and a New Haven native, Katy Rubin, Grammy Award winning Angélique Kidjo, and the 2012 Inaugural Poet Richard Blanco. Our conversation is going to be moderated by the New Haven Arts Paper editor, Lucy Gelman. But first, a poem. Enjoy.
Hi, everyone. One today. One sun rose on us today, kindled over our shores, peeking over the Smokies, greeting the faces of the Great Lakes, spreading a simple truth across the Great Plains, then charging over the Rockies. One light, waking up rooftops, under each one a story told by our silent gestures moving behind windows. My face, your face, millions of faces in morning's mirrors, each one yawning to life, crescendoing into our day. Pencil yellow school buses, the rhythm of traffic lights, fruit stands, apples, limes, and oranges, arrayed like rainbows begging our praise. Silver trucks heavy with oil or paper, bricks or milk, teeming over highways alongside us, on our way to clean tables, read ledgers, or save lives, to teach geometry or ring up groceries, as my mother did for 20 years, so I could write this poem for us today. All of us, as vital as the one light we move through. The same light on blackboards with lessons for the day, equations to solve, history to question, or atoms imagined. The I have a dream we keep dreaming, or the impossible vocabulary of sorrow that won't explain the empty desks of 20 children marked absent today and forever. Many prayers, but one light, breathing color into stained glass windows, life into the faces of bronze statues, warmth onto the steps of our museums and park benches as mothers watch their children slide into the day. One ground, our ground, rooting us to every stalk of corn, every head of wheat sown by sweat and hands, hands gleaning coal or planting windmills in deserts and hilltops that keep us warm, hands digging trenches, hands routing pipes and cables, hands as worn as my father's cutting sugarcane, so my brother and I could have books and shoes. The dust of our farms and deserts, our cities and plains mingled by one wind, our breath. Breathe. Hear it through the day's gorgeous din of honking cabs, buses launching down avenues, the symphony of footsteps, guitars, and screeching subways, the unexpected songbird on your clothesline. Here, squeaky playground swings, trains whistling or whispers across cafe tables. Here, the doors we open for each other all day, saying, hello, shalom, buongiorno, howdy, namaste, or buenos dias. In the language my mother taught me, in every language, spoken into one wind, carrying our lives without prejudice, as these words break from my lips. One sky, since the Appalachians and Sierras claimed their majesty, and the Mississippi and Colorado worked their way to the sea. Thank the work of our hands, weaving steel into bridges, finishing one more report for the boss on time, stitching another wound or uniform. The first brushstroke on a portrait, or the last floor on the Freedom Tower jutting into the sky that yields to our resilience, one sky toward which we sometimes lift our eyes, tired from work. Some days guessing at the weather of our lives, some days giving thanks for a love that loves you back. Sometimes praising a mother who knew how to give, or forgiving a father who couldn't give what you wanted. Still, we head home through the gloss of rain or weight of snow, or the plum blush of dusk, but always, always home, always under one sky, our sky, and always one moon, like a silent drum tapping on every rooftop and every window of one country, all of us facing the stars and hope. A new constellation, still waiting for us to map it, still waiting for us to name it together.
Is this applause? I think so. Thank you, Richard, so much. I'm Lucy Gelman, and I'm so excited to be here today with this superstar panel of Richard Blanco, Angélique Kidjo, Larissa FastHorse, and Katy Rubin. I think for a lot of us, our hearts feel very heavy and hope might be hard to summon right now, so this panel feels right on time, if not long overdue. Richard, I want to jump right in with a question for you. You wrote that poem 8 years ago at a very specific moment, not only for you, I imagine, but for the U.S. What did that poem mean to you then, and where is it falling for you right now?
Sure. Well, I should say that one of the hardest things about writing the poem wasn't the writing of the poem itself, but rather sort of getting sort of an emotional block, because I think the question I had to ask myself was, do I love this country? Am I part of this country? Does this country like me totally back? My narrative as an immigrant, as an exile, as a gay man, is that part of this narrative? And how can I write a poem for our country if I don't believe that? So in a way, the poem is a response to something that was already sort of something I was struggling with. And it's a response to that, to say, yes, I want to claim this narrative. I am one of these people moving about our day, moving in this space. And of course, the presidency of Obama for me personally also meant that. Here's this person who I besides the politics, I feel connected with, because it's sort of against all odds becomes the first African American president, but also just sort of I don't want to say quintessential American dream story, that's cliche, but in a way that was part of the inspiration. Where I am now with it is that I think I felt we had turned a corner, but not that everything was perfect. And the poem has its tension. The poem is about still waiting for us to name it, waiting for us to really come together, right? To fulfill the model of as many of our out of the many one. And so now I think the poem for me is a reminder, a manifesto of where we need to keep on working, together to fulfill that same narrative, to fulfill or complete that narrative, to unearth the narratives of America that have been oppressed, that have been completely prejudiced against, right? And how do we continue to write that story of what is a democracy? So in a way, I gotta say, the poem for me gives me even more sort of chutzpah because it's more needed. I mean, I think what's there is even more needed now than before. So and I guess that's the function of poetry in some ways. Overall, poetry always comes back to haunt us in ways that are really surprising. They always sort of find a new context for the time. So that's where I'm at with right now, sort of taking it as marching orders, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, from that, it occurs to me that we are a panel spread across 4 different sovereign nations and 4 different time zones. So I know we have some folks who are approaching bedtime, and I appreciate you being with us. But it seems important to me that each of you get a chance to talk about your own personal definition of what democracy is and what it means. So I'm wondering if we can go into that. And Larissa, I would like to start with you.
Yeah, when you told us we're going to talk about democracy, this wasn't the original name of the panel I was on. So I was like, oh shoot, democracy. I don't think about democracy like at all. I'm a member of the Sichangu Lakota Nation, which is located within the geographic boundaries of what's now called the United States. And I don't think a lot about the United States government, to be honest. But I was reading about democracy to see what it meant. I'm a writer, I don't know. And my favorite, the thing that really struck for me as an artist was the Webster's 5th definition of democracy, which I'm reading here, says the absence of hereditary or arbitrary class distinctions or privileges. And that really spoke to me. I was like, oh, that's what my entire theatrical life is about, is trying to erase those privileges and class distinctions, which is really hard in the field I work in, which is American theater. Really hard. We're very much a class-based system in the way American theater has been created and funded and run. Those with money get much higher privileges, and those without don't even get to come. And so it to me, I was like, wow, that's so apparently democracy is at the center of everything I do as an artist, and I didn't know that. And so that was nice to learn. So I appreciate you asking about it, Lucy. So for me, that's the part of it that I'm interested in. The part that's exciting is like erasing those distinctions, erasing those classes, and really making sure that art is for everybody. And in the world I'm in, it's a pretty tough thing to do.
Katie, would you like to jump in? Oh, anyone can go. This is the fun part about being online. Oh yes, applause.
Sure, I will. I can jump in. When you asked us to think about what democracy is, I could only think about what I wish it was, how I want it to feel. And I thought about, democracy to me is not necessarily about voting or not just about voting. It's not about politicians. It's not certainly about just improving a system that currently exists in any place or within any community. But for me, it's about a process, an ever evolving process towards structural change. And the need for change keeps changing. And I thought about the metaphor of a game, specifically in Theater of the Oppressed, we play a lot of games. And when you enter into a game, you create the rules, or you know the rules before you start, and you enter into those rules willingly. And then within those rules, those boundaries, there's a purpose of the game, which is in the Theater of the Oppressed, not to be a better actor, but to be a better actor in your own life and in the world. And I think about the purpose to me of democracy is first to meet our basic needs in order that we can continue to act on the world, because the needs of the process are going to keep changing. The process is going to keep changing, and the needs for the rules, how the rules need to be shaped, are going to keep changing forever. It's not going to reach a static point. And then I thought also that a democracy's purpose, and democracy doesn't have to be just a government, it's any community that wants to create boundaries in order to protect and support itself. It can't be separated from the way it feels for people to participate in it and experience it. And the way that I wish it felt in this game metaphor is fun and joyful. And when I say fun, I'm always a little nervous to say that because the issues, the things we need to change are serious, and they themselves are not fun. But I think that fun and joy, serious fun, and joyful seriousness are key because without those, people aren't going to show up. I think they're not, or I'm not going to show up for the revolution, and I'm therefore definitely not going to show up for the democracy. And that's one. And two is that fun has a way of making power distinctions start to dissipate, because power thrives on fear. And fear, and that rearranging power is one of the keys for me to a democracy, continually rearranging it. Who's on the stage, who asks the questions, who gets to write the policies, who people are accountable to, how those things happen. And so using fun to continue to demechanize and break apart those structures of power. That's where I want to be.
Democracy for me is, first of all, freedom. There's no freedom, there's no democracy. And if we don't fight for our freedom, we can't fight for the greater good or anything we talk about. Any structure, any idea, anything. When people come to participate in a society, when you're not free to speak up, you're not free to be yourself, your gender matters, your skin color matters. Everywhere you go, you are put below the ladders because you don't belong. Privilege is not democracy. That's what she said. But we use the word democracy, and nothing that defines democracy is in there. So I left my country running away from dictatorship. And today I'm hearing people fantasizing about dictatorship. You don't know what it is until it hits you. Because once somebody gets its hands on you and take your freedom away, it will take generations or centuries to free you. My people have been enslaved for 400 years, and we are still living with the stigma of it today. So when we talk about democracy, we have to think about how we perceive ourselves within a society that is built on division, on discrimination, not equality at all, with privilege, with people that have property. When you have property and it's okay for you to own people as property, and you build your wealth, the capital is based on people's work that you never pay. How can you build up from ground up if that is not dealt with at the beginning and come to a leverage where we bring everybody at the same level to discuss democracy, to participate in democracy? And if we are participating in democracy, we've already a tag on each other. Your voice counts for this, your voice counts for that. But it's never going to be a democracy if we are not all at the same level of rights.
Richard, I want to make sure that your voice is in there too. And I do have a follow-up question, but hop in.
Sure. I think I lost I pressed something. I don't know what happened. I just want to say, I mean, just listening to all of us here, I think that for me, and I was thinking about this obviously in the other context, that to me, democracy is the question of democracy in some ways. This is something we say in poetry. Sometimes the poem itself is the question. And going off what Angélique said, of course, that the freedom to ask those questions, the freedom to have dialogue, and the freedom to or I should say, who's not involved in that dialogue. But to me, a democracy is constant work in progress. It's a constant struggle. It's about opening up dialogue. It's about seeing what's wrong, keep on working on it. So to me, it's not something that I can neatly put a finger on, but something that's always completely evolving. And maybe that separates it from maybe some other ideologies, I'm thinking, but just the fact that how many different perspectives we have on the screen, and yet, it's all part of, to me, that's democracy making, right? Like you said, we can't just call it, oh, we have a democracy, period, end of story. Like, we certainly know that's not true, right? So I think it's the constant questioning for me that really the opening, a society that is constantly questioning and opening up who gets to include, who gets to be in that dialogue, continuing to open up that conversation is what, for me, and is democracy, or how I mock the evolvement of a democracy. I don't know that we'll ever get there.
I mean, really, that was my that was one of my follow-up questions, which is democracy an idea to which we are always striving, to which artists are always striving, or is it something that each of you have a concrete idea of? And if so, I guess, how are you implementing it with your specific art form or different media?
Well, without democracy, how can we do anything? That's why I put freedom at the center of it. Because each one of us, when we start writing something, an idea on a paper or a piece of theater or whatever it is that we are writing, is because we know that the outcome of it is to perform it on stage, to bring it out there and to share with people. And that freedom is the beginning of a foundation of a democracy ever evolving, because we as human beings, we are ever evolving. We cannot have a democracy that is set in stone. It's not possible. What happened 50, 100 years ago cannot happen today, because it's a different century and there are different people and we are facing different realities. So for me as an artist, it's always about how can I use my art to make people think, to make people see me as a human being equal to them. One thing that I learned from the traditional musician in my country, that was one of the first things. I was, 10 years old. I was like, hold on a minute. This song, the word is gruesome and everybody's dancing. What is going on, y'all? And my aunties and uncle, they sat me down. They say, well, let me tell you something. When you are gifted with a talent of arts, your responsibility is to entertain and empower people. Till you pay attention to the lyrics, you were dancing, having fun. That's what you're supposed to do. When people go back and they start listening, the fun they had will make them realize the lyrics that you're singing, what it meant to each one of them will be different from what you think you are trying to tell them. And that's when people make their own decision to act upon the subject you're singing about. It's not up to you to make them feel guilty. It's up to you to give them wings to fly. So that's all I do all the time. And for me, that's why I said democracy principally is about freedom in every way. The way to earn your living with no discrimination, the way to have your opinion with no discrimination, the way to see and to say things without any string attached, and trust. Truth have to be at the center of it. There's no trust, there's no society. And that's one thing also that is there. Moral value that we have together. We all here have moral value. We know what is right and what is wrong. And within democracy, the policymaker and the lawmaker have to follow those values. When you have people in place that are not following those values, that are not truthful, that are not using the policy right for everybody to have a say in this discussion of democracy, the whole society collapses.
So I have a question for Katy, but I want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to, this is the bad thing about not being in person, that everyone has an opportunity to jump in if they so wish before I get into that.
I think Angélique said it.
Yeah. I know. I feel fired up. I love it.
Let's go.
I just want to do echo Angélique's, like, there is the baseline of freedom. If there's no dialogue without freedom, right? And that's something I share also in my parents' history more. Right? If that freedom's gone, then that sort of is a baseline where democracy sort of ceases to exist, whether that's as a country or in communities or in regions. But that I really wanted to echo that's really important. There's without freedom, there's no dialogue. Therefore, we wouldn't be able to sit here and do this, right?
No.
Yeah. Well, even that word freedom, Katy, makes me think of one question that I've had sort of kicking around my mind for you, which is to talk a little bit about what legislative theater is as a concept for those who may be listening and may be unfamiliar with it, and specifically how folks can take part in it, but also how they can be allies to it or arts accomplices, whatever that may mean.
Yeah, great. I'm thinking, I'm also kind of sparked by where the conversation is right now and thinking about freedom and also thinking about kind of the metaphor I was using about a game and the boundaries within the game. And I think that legislative theater in itself talks about changing rules or changing policies or changing, and it's not just governments, it's not just legislation, it's not just policies, it's also rules in communities, ways of working. And so I do see I do see that we need those kind of, at least in the way that the world that we live in right now, we need boundaries that we've come together around in order to protect each other from violence and to ensure that each other have basic human needs. So legislative theater is a part of the work of Theater of the Oppressed, which comes from Brazil in the 60s and 70s, started by a man named Augusto Boal. And I am the founder and former executive director of Theater of the Oppressed NYC, which is was a home for doing that work in New York City, or is a home. And I was there, and now I'm a big fan of TONYC. And legislative theater is a process that we started getting into as we really came up against the problems coming up in our plays are totally constantly about institutional oppression, structural oppression, and they need structural change. And if we don't have the people who currently have the power over some of those structures and different kinds of power from different angles participating in that process with us and a real goal towards changing some of those structures, those rules, those policies, then we're not really going to change what needs to be changed for people's lives. So just briefly how it works in the Theater of the Oppressed, a community that's facing a situation of oppression based on race, based on class, based on gender, any system of oppression that's occurring in an institution like healthcare or housing or public transportation or the arts, maybe. Will
maybe no, yeah.
Go
Definitely.
in. Go in.
Absolutely. Create a play based on their own lived experiences of that problem. Yeah. And that's a play about the collective experience, not sort of one person's experience. It's really about, we're a community. We've had a lot of these same experiences. And that play comes to an audience of stakeholders from all across the spectrum who are working on that issue. So it could be people who are directly impacted by that issue, people who are working on it, people who are making decisions about it, like legislators, council members, people in government, activists, advocates. And in this legislative theater session, there becomes no such thing as an audience anymore. So you asked how people can be allies, and I think even that word in the Theater of the Oppressed, we use a word called spect-actor. No one is a spectator. Everybody is ready to take action and is going to be called upon to take action. And there is no such thing as a spectator who doesn't take action. We are all preparing to be actors, and we are going to be called on to be actors in our lives, in our communities' challenges. And in that call, we invite those spectators, the audience who became spectators, to come on stage and try out ideas alongside the actors in the different roles to try to change the problem. And through that forum, right, improvising new ideas, we start to reveal more about the bureaucracy behind the problems, the rules, the structures, the kind of power chain that's causing that problem, whether that's, again, in any institution where systems of oppression are impacting people, which is really every institution. And then those ideas and that critical analysis turn into policy proposals. So the audience, literally, the spectators, write policy proposals inspired by what their neighbors in the audience tried on stage. and what we learned about the problem. And then the council members, the city agencies, the activists, the advocates, we call all those folks policy rangers, like Power Rangers, who have lots of different powers around policy. They help the audience sort and filter those ideas. So you do a processing, a democratic process, a process of, Boal called it metabolizing policy ideas right there. And there's amendments and there's dissent. And finally, there's voting. And the folks who are there, the decision makers, commit to what actions they're going to take on the policies that the audience propose in response to the problem. And they say how long, how you can follow up. And then the Theater de Press NYC, and now I, in my other work in other parts of the US and around the UK, continue to, with the community, continue to push those decision makers to follow up on those rules, suggestions, new procedures, and lots of changes have been made through that process in New York, now in Manchester, UK, where I'm living, and in Brazil when Boal first started this in around 1990.
So we should do legislative theater on a social scale, because what is going on right now is exactly what you're saying. Mm-hmm. When the local newspaper closed down, then the local taxes of the people living in those counties goes up. The police goes up. I mean, it's just crazy. We're using this beautiful platform to be talking. It's a very good, very, very good tool. But if we don't, as citizens of this world, pay attention to the fact that every local newspaper that disappear is our power of vote, of knowing exactly what is going on, because the local journalists are the ones that are going to tell you. The national news is not talking about the local news. So therefore, our power, our freedom is already being infringed upon. Every time a local newspaper is gone, we don't do nothing about it. It's good to do theater. But what I say all the time is that talk is cheap, action is expensive. Why aren't we as citizens holding people accountable? When you witness injustice, you stand up for it. Injustice has no color, no nationality, no language. But by our silence, our complacency, individualism, our selfishness, we have allowed the leaders of this world dictate how we breathe, how we eat, who we see. We are completely controlled by all this new network. We're talking here, how many people are spying on what we're saying? So that's what I'm saying. Without freedom, there's no democracy. And this machine, what we are using, is also one of the tools that is really breaking democracy.
Well, that does bring me to a question, but I want to make sure, especially because the word democracy is in the title of this panel, that we are also hearing from the audience. I'm wondering if we can get an audience question. Maybe.
I want to hear Larissa, man. Richard? Can we hear you too?
Yes, sorry. I also do want to ask about how artists can, Katy, my mind is just spinning because you also brought up the fact that the arts are often complacent in systems of white supremacy. And sort of within that, you've got the carceral state, you've got the military industrial complex. How can artists, and I think each of you are already doing this, be working to disseminate vital information? Because Angélique, you're absolutely correct. There is a crisis with local news right now, and it's been happening for some time. During
That's
COVID,
the beginning of dictatorship. I'm telling you right there, because I know what it is.
Yes.
I can smell it.
Yeah, and there are a number of news companies right now that have said, well, these layoffs are caused by COVID-19, and actually the writing has been on the wall for some time. So I'm interested from all of you, how can artists work to disseminate that vital information to people who might not be entirely converted?
I mean, my career is, since I work in American theater, is very it's split. So I have two halves of it. So I have the one half I'm writing to white people specifically, and then I have the other half where I'm representing Indigenous people entirely in their own voices. So you know, it's very strategic for me. I didn't get into theater to write theater. I got into theater to change the world, and it was a medium that was willing to let me do that. And a medium, a field that was willing to let me say whatever I wanted to say, which I hadn't found in film or television at that time, which is where I previously worked. So for me, it's very strategic. My entire career, the only reason I'm an artist is to change the way people think. Everything I write is, you know, and I'm working in a very limited field though, because we're only talking to like 3-4% of the population, which is a bummer. But there we are. That's what I have to work with. But everything I write, I do a lot of studying of the brain and the way your brain works, and the way I do a lot of study with neurobiologists, so that my plays are actually literally built to change the biology of your brain and the way your brain is wired. And so they're very specifically calculated moment to moment to change the way that white people think, because that's the audience we have in theater here in America is white folks primarily. So everything I do on that side, but then it's the unfortunate part is though in America, those two things are split. I'm either writing for Indigenous people or I'm writing for white people. And though there isn't a cross yet, those things, which is a real bummer. So for me, it's definitely constantly an issue. And it's actually part of the reason I just went back to film and television, because I just feel like I need to be reaching a lot more people to be changing more brains.
Thank God I don't have that problem. I mean, it's saddening to hear that, but at the same time, it has to be done the way you're doing it, because that's the only way we have right there to be doing this. But the thing that is really important for me every time that is a reminder is that I know I'm a human being before being African, before being a woman. Those things has been set for me since I was a child. I settled with that, with my mom, my dad, my grandmothers. They told me, if you don't know who you are, be aware you can't go nowhere. So for me, art has always been the one thing really that allowed me to go anywhere in the world. Because my father said, talent has no gender. Intelligence has no gender. Go out there and challenge people's brain. I don't need to do a neuroscience to understand that emotion touches everybody. If you are in the truth of what you're doing and you get on that stage, as my mom used to say, when you get to that stage, you have to be ready to be naked spiritually. It took me years to understand that. But once you accept that vulnerability of yourself, letting your guard down to give everything you have, people get it. You don't need to translate anything. People start thinking and bringing people together. My entire career has been building bridges between culture, because there's only one humanity, there's only one ecosystem, and COVID-19 today is proving us on the dot that if we don't stand up for one another, we're gonna disappear. So that's where my art come from. I never had that issue of white, black, yellow, red, because I was raised colorblind. My father always said, don't come back here complaining and tell me you failed because you're black, because I will beat you that day. So that's it. And then for me, I always say we all have issues to deal with. My issues will always be my issues, but my issues are also somebody's issue. Because what I go through, a lot of people, everybody at one point goes through discrimination. Everybody, the white, the black, the yellow, the red, the gay, the non-gay, everybody goes through discrimination. But we need to learn from those moments when we are discriminate and we start thinking, but who are you to say? And then you have to come back to yourself and say to yourself, that is ignorance. How do I educate this ignorant person? That's it for me.
Oh, sorry, Richard.
Oh, I was just saying, it's a wonderful conversation. I mean, getting into the idea of democracy and poetry, I mean, and the arts and how they intersect, those are just great comments. I think I'm always sort of really hyper aware of that as well, knowing that the story I have is not necessarily mainstream, right, as a gay Cuban immigrant and whatnot, and trying to always find that right balance, but also always saying to myself, this is this is the window dressing on my story, but my story is ultimately, you're saying, Angélique, about being a human being in this world. And if there's anything that and I think the arts in general, what each of us are doing, what all artists in all sort of fields are doing, is trying to bridge was a perfect word, trying to bridge that space that we're not going to get from the news, that we're not going to get from politicians, that we're not going to get from necessarily really popular media. And so the idea, I've always felt that that's part of my role as an artist. And it's a tricky, slippery slope, because on the one hand, am I placating to some white man's version of, why don't you understand my life if I've had to understand your life all my life, right? But at the end of the day, is that really going to solve anything? I mean, is it going to? So the artist, I think, always tries to be the I guess the thought leader, the person that says, you know what, like Jane Hirschfield said, a poem is nothing more than someone holding out a hand and saying, "Me too. I too have been," and so creating a bridge of empathy, of understanding, a dialogue, and I guess that's just a really important. Not that there's a final answer either, but all those questions we're negotiating with as artists and how we're trying to make. I think we could all argue that if anything, we're trying to bridge things. We're not trying to pull things further apart. We're trying to bridge things through both understanding our stories, and, like Angélique said, also transcending them in some weird way. I love entering a poem and writing a poem because I transcend the very story, the very struggle that I went into the poem with. And in a way, I offered that journey to someone else. And one of the greatest compliments that anybody can say to me is like someone like some non-Cuban, like whatever, some guy from somewhere in the Midwest, I don't know, to just say, to read one of my poems about my grandmother and me eating mangoes and say, that poem reminded me about my mother when she and I know art has done something, right? And I can't control that. Like you were saying, Angélique, we can't always control that. Our hearts just speak naturally. We're doing that work all the time. And it keeps us centered. I think that's ultimately the payoff, is to find a little more joy, like Katy, you're saying, a little more fun in the world, like open up that space because it can get really heavy too, right? It can get really heavy, and like we gotta sing, we gotta dance, we gotta just enjoy a poem for enjoying it for a moment, right? So anyway, just echoing with everything that you're saying, but also the struggles of being an artist in these days, where we have that fine line that we always have to sort of negotiate between, how much are we just placating, how much is mission, how much are, you know what I'm saying. And this is like Larissa was saying, that's a real authentic sort of, something we have to negotiate all the time. And I do wonder, do all artists do that? Does the white guy in Minnesota have to translate that boundary? Maybe a class boundary, maybe not a race boundary. I mean, I think we all have boundaries in some ways, maybe a boundary of their own ignorance. But anyway, I'm cutting myself off.
Well, I do want to ask Larissa about this specifically, because as I sort of see this beautiful world taking shape in one way, and also this panel is taking place under the incredibly heavy specter of white supremacy and murder that has taken place this week, but also just a country that values some bodies and white bodies specifically more than others. Larissa, you've spoken about the ability of art to serve Indigenous peoples specifically. And in speaking on your Lakota project, which I would love for you to speak a little bit more about, last year you said, and I'm quoting here, "There is no time when art or production becomes greater than community desires," end quote. What does that mean in your own practice? And what can folks listening sort of how can they bring that to their practice? How can they infuse their practice with it? Or maybe if they are in the historically white world of theater or of arts, how can they be accomplices?
Yeah, wow, that's a lot of questions.
Sorry.
No, that's right. I got it. I got it. So yeah, I think, you know, the first thing I was going to say, just in looking, also, I just want to throw into it because it's part of it. One of the questions here about the revolution, right? Is that I really, you know, my dream is that being in theater, that every theater in this country is engaged meaningfully and equitably with Indigenous people on whose land they are profiting from, because every theater in this country is profiting from stolen land and from stolen money. And my goal is that every theater acknowledges that and then starts making reparations in whatever way they're able to. So in that, the way that I work and the way that I advise people, because I also have a consulting company that works with a lot of companies, in addition to being an artist, what we advise people to do is basically just listen. It sounds crazy, but it's shocking how few people listen.
Oh, listen.
Yeah, right. No one listens. So when I work with different communities, like the Lakota Project, which is the third in a trilogy of plays I've been doing with Cornerstone Theater Company with different Indigenous populations, we work over several years. The first year, we just listen. We don't try to envision, we don't plan, we don't do any artistic anything. We just listen. We come into a community, Indigenous community, and we say, here are the resources we have available. Are any of these of interest to you? And then we follow through on that for a year. Some of it is theater related. Some of it, the last project we just did, we said, well, we need some bodies to winterize elders' homes up on this reservation in the mountains. And we're like, great, we can do that. We know how to hammer things, or you can show us how, you know. And so the process of what we do can be anything, and that is theater making. It's something, you know, Katy and both Angélique and Katy mentioned earlier, you know, just creating as much equity as we can within a community. A lot of our work is around feeding people and making sure people are fed, making sure elders are cared for, children are cared for, basically being of service in whatever way we can to the community. And that is the theater. Because of the way our world is set up and because of the desires of community, we do a thing at the end, which would be called a performance in Western theater. That isn't the thing, that just is a thing that happens at the end of these 2 and 3 year processes. And that is part of it. And so the important thing that's different in the way I work than a lot of artists work, and with my partner, Michael John Garces, who has been my partner and collaborator on all these projects. The important thing is that the community always has control over everything, every word, every action, everything that's done. And the difference between what we do and, like, so democracy, I was looking at the first definition of democracy, says government by the people, especially rule of the majority. And that is not at all what I do. So I realized I don't do democracy in my work because I don't believe in the rule of the majority. I believe in the rule of every individual. And so if any individual comes to us while we're making our art and says, hey, this isn't right, you need to change it, we just do it. We don't wait for a majority to rule. We change and give veto power over everything to every single artist. Throughout history of America, the arts have been and continue to be an extraction industry for Indigenous peoples. And they come in, they steal everything they want, they suck all the good stuff out, they leave and they profit from it. And they generally leave the Indigenous communities poorer for it. Every art field does it. And we're trying to flip that and make sure that art is always serving community as opposed to taking from community or even representing community. Everything we do is just being about service to them. Yeah, that's I'm trying to answer all the things. There were so many things. And I do want to call out, because it's been mentioned twice already in the comments about disabled folks. And I think we really need to talk about that. Our work is done with a lot of elders. So my community is entirely centered around elders and caring for elders. So we spend a tremendous amount of time working with elders, figuring out how to make our work accessible, the thing at the end, how to make it accessible, but also how to make the whole process accessible to elders and disabled folks. We go to them in their homes, we visit them, we built, you know, if they needed a ramp built, we build ramps, and we just do whatever people need. And that includes everybody in the community and making sure everybody has access. Even though I do, the pieces so far have all been immersive and outdoor, we make sure they're completely accessible to anybody who wants to participate, whether whatever their limitations are, we will meet them in the way that makes them happy, and we follow their lead for what it is they need. And that's just part of our entire ethos for how we work and how we are of service, as opposed to taking.
Thank you. I'm wondering if we can get the question about disabled folks back on screen. Thank you very much. When will people with disabilities be mentioned, included, and featured? We are never, quote, normal and often confined. Folks in hospitals, nursing homes, and prisons are infected and dying. Non-white people are most likely to have disabilities and to be confined.
That's true. That's the face of COVID-19. COVID-19 is exposing all the failure and the flaw of the system that we had. We discriminate against disabled people and people that we don't think that have the right to the good service that we all have. And today, we are all celebrating the nursing, the doctors, and people that work in supermarket. They've been transparent. Nobody say thank you to them ever. Nobody ever think that they are essential to our lives, our economy, in our community. And let us not fool ourselves. This COVID-19, the after COVID-19, we have to really be on our guard to make sure that we have this, if we change our surrounding, our system to include everybody, the disabled people, the elderly people, everybody that can participate in the society at any capacity have to be able to participate in the society. We cannot continue like this because the COVID-19 is a warning. Everybody brings something to the table, and we live in a society that point finger out and say, you are not, you're old, you don't belong. You are blind, you don't belong. You are disabled. No. We gotta stop this. This is not what we are, and this is not who we should be.
Would anyone else like to jump in? I will say one question that I could be for everyone, but I have specifically for theater and film and television folks. So I will often find myself getting annoyed if I watch a show, for instance, about someone who has a disability and it's a perfectly able-bodied actor, or for that matter, if a show is about trans folk and it's played by a white cisgender actor, and so yeah, I'm curious about that question about putting disabled bodies on stage in films, in popular media.
I'll pop in for a second, but just quickly, and I think this has been coming up in some of the things that we've been saying already, kind of this idea that there's this tension between everyone is a human and also everyone does not have the same experiences. And I don't have the same experiences of all kinds of people, and yet absolutely I believe that there's a goal of in legislative theater, there's a question of how have my experiences facing oppression, can I engage in the struggle that you are talking about in order to fight my own experiences of oppression, right? Not as an advice giver and, but in an ally in the deepest sense of solidarity, not even an ally, like really I need to change that for myself also. And I think that, there's this other question that we've been talking about, who's an artist and kind of what do artists need? And I think there's one of the challenges that I see is that I think that everyone is an artist. And I think that deciding who's an artist and who isn't an artist is the first step towards dividing who gets to have roles of power in the American theater. And then people who are in power choose people who look like them or act like them to have other roles and have power, right? If that's a person with disabilities, if that's a person of color, if that's a person who's queer, a trans person, they are going to being in power means that you bring other people into your space because you know that is needed. So I think that one of the problems is that we keep having white people in power and kind of asking them to make some space. And I think those white people need to get out of the way in a lot of spaces because it's not about asking them to make space. They're not going to do it right. They don't know what it's like to be everybody.
No,
we don't.
It's true. It's true. I don't know how to be white, but yet I don't discriminate. The thing is, we don't have smart politicians. We have politicians that comes to power for their own benefits. There is a say that said, when you have power, you don't use it. From the moment you use the power, you don't have power anymore. So the thing is, we have people in power that come to power with no vision at all, no knowledge at all about the country they grow up in. Because let's take the example of America. White people living with white folks, black people living with black folks. There's no mixture. I mean, we have a lot of diversity in America, but there's not a real true melting pot of people living together. White kids go to different schools, black. And if we start changing that, out of that, we'll have different leaders. It's not just talking, it's acting. Let's cut all those nonsense out. School is for everybody, rich or poor. Health is for everybody, rich or poor. Those two things are fundamental right to every single human being. We should not speculate on health. We should not speculate on education whatsoever. Because once we do that, once our system collapse, everybody just disappear with it. Disabled, not disabled. I mean, it's just that crazy. I've been living in America since 1997, and I left my country, Benin, running away from dictatorship, and I arrived in America. I arrived in the Western world, and I was expecting to see equality, solidarity, freedom. And all I walk into, people asking me, "Oh, in your country, do you go do your grocery shopping on the back of an elephant?" And I say, "Yes." And I have monkeys on both on my head to help me carry my groceries too. I mean, it's crazy. It's so crazy. Sometimes I'm like, do I have the energy in me to educate somebody like that? We're in the 21st century. You can go find out what it is. Africa is not a country.
That's me.
It's a continent.
My TP, Angélique.
It is just crazy. I mean, all we're talking about is just kind of good sense. Just think. Be smart at once. Don't take things people tell you as the truth. Find out. You don't know somebody, talk to the person. Why can't we talk to one another? Can we?
So actually, I want to hear more from the audience, but Richard, I want to pull you into the conversation. I know that you've talked about the role of all of you, but Richard, you've talked about the role of artist as educator as well. And I want to ask you a little bit about that. And specifically, not just what can words do right now, but what can words be doing? Because they are like very powerful. Words have weight, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. That ever pressing question of like, how can poetry change the world, so to speak, right? And my kind of odd answer to that is that I don't believe that poetry can change the world. I'm not that naive. I do believe that. And I'm kind of cheating on the answer here, but I do believe that a poem can change one person, and that person can change the world. And what I'm trying to say, that there's ripple effects, and that's how that's where I approach my work in my particular field in poetry, as education ambassador for the Academy of American Poets, which is to increase access to poetry by changing the way it's taught, first of all, but also including all these diverse voices of America, past, present, and really giving poetry that is reflective of the reality of of the faces in the classroom and the lives in the classrooms. Because I know that was incredibly different. I mean, incredibly transformative moment to me. It was when I read Sanders v. Cisneros for the first time, and got, oh, I get to tell my story, really? So I just that's what I feel like. If there's like another little Barack Obama somewhere there in 4th grade who's reading a poem, and so I try to write from that perspective too. A poem is not just always the subject matter or what it's trying to fight for, but sometimes it's just about something even beyond that, even beyond a sense of giving the reader an empowerment of a kind that you can't even perhaps even put a certain kind of self pride in the self, a certain kind of empowerment that you can't always put a word to or a definition on. And yeah, so that's what I try to do with poetry. And again, there are poems, I guess, that I've always, again, getting back to the question, it's always for me been a slippery slope. I've never considered myself a political poet in the sense that I've never sort of head on taken on subjects except for this last book, because it's unprecedented in my lifetime that obviously there's a time when poems need to speak up in different ways. But yeah, I've always tried to think about and balance the idea of what a poem, at the end of the day, am I in an echo chamber, right? Am I building a bridge? Am I breaking down a wall? Am I placating too much to the audience that is the oppressor? Some things that I think about. I guess at the end of the day, I want a poem, my poem, someone else's poem that I read, a poem that I teach, to leave us in a space that is different than where we began, because we can stay in spaces of hate and anger and recognize injustices. And I guess I think there's an important word that we're kind of forgetting here. But, to me, acting out of love at the end of the day, which I think we all are, is really fundamentally what keeps our wells, replenishes our wells. If we're not acting out of love, out of honest sort of love for ourselves first, love for others, love for humanity, love for a better world, and that's kind of what I try to do with my work. Always go that other step. That, yes, present the issue, present the problem, protest it, but then what's the way out? How can art? How can I don't want to say art, but how can I imagine some other space? And that's what I think poems are best at doing. Much like music, I think poems and music are so close together, right? They have the power to sometimes build that kind of bridge that lets us invisibly sort of hold hands some ways. And maybe I'm being too Pollyanna, but but anyway.
No, I think we have another question from the audience. Great. Thank you so much. This is from, hello, Fahad. I know Fahad. Hello. The role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. That's a quote from Tony Cade Bambara. What's the revolution that you'd like to make irresistible, and why, for all the panelists?
Whoa. Why do you start talking about revolution? You bring me back to communist regime. Ooh, yeah. Well, what do we mean by revolution? That's the question I want to know. I want an answer to. I will engage in a revolution if it's to build a different world, changing the rule and make it more fair for everybody. I'm not about a revolution that go around and break things, create chaos, and leave the chaos hanging. I need to construct something. I need to build something from scratch. I'm not for violence. I don't believe in it. And with my art, what I try to do is change people's heart. People try to make them to think differently about why are we so angry or dissatisfied with our lives, with our society. We need to find the response to the fact that we are not feeling okay in the time we live in. We need definitely to do that, to go deep in ourselves and find an answer that can put us at ease. Then create alliances with people that think like us and bring ideas together for us to build something, not to break everything. That's my revolution.
This question was for everyone, so I hope to, yeah.
I just want to jump in back to Larissa, also the first definition of majority by rule. And so this is a great quote, but I also, in a way, I think it's using like the same language that got us in a way in this mess in the first place. And I understand it's figurative, but like you were saying also, Angélique, it's like, it's not that kind of revolution, right? So the absence of revolution is almost like what we need, and it's not the majority by rule, because then who's to say if the majority changes, then that's the rule for everybody, right? So it's just sort of really shifting that paradigm of this is wrong and we know what's right, and therefore this is going to change, et cetera. Period, for everybody, right? And that's the danger that we all face whenever we're impassioned, whenever we are, even when we're fighting for something that is legitimately true. But again, fighting, revolution, this language we can't get away from, right? It always seems like this us against them. But I would say my revolution would be against revolution. Yes, in a way. And I just stayed with Larissa's first sort of definition of democracy as how absolutely absurd that is. The rule by the majority, which changes every day and every 5 minutes and every, or can, right? So and why is the majority right? And why are they wrong as well, right?
Agreed. Also, and I'm a pacifist myself, but also we do have a different, so we have, as far as indigenous folks, so it's very different because we're talking about sovereign nations. So it's a political definition we're talking about as opposed to a philosophical or race or whatever, you know what I mean? So we're talking about 560 some sovereign nations located within the boundaries of this particular nation called the United States. So it definitely, revolution, all these things are very different for us because they are actually legally upheld political issues that we're trying to just get the government to recognize what the Supreme Court has said is true and is law. And so it is very different for us. It's not about race, it's not about color, it's not about culture, it's about actual law that the United States government is not upholding and is ignoring with their own laws. Just want to call that out.
Thank you.
I love all of these responses are circling in my head, and I think I'm with you about there's not one revolution, there's not one static place to be, and I think we've said this before. But I guess the world that I'm dreaming of is that for me there is some fighting or some activation. We don't have to use the word fighting, but that everyone around me is activated against oppression, and that is a movement, and that movement is literally everyone I can see is activated against oppression that they experience and that their neighbors experience towards liberation, towards equity, and that's never going to be one standstill point. So my revolution that I'm looking for, is that that we're naming it, and that we're continually fighting it, and that is why I feel so energized when I do see a movement swell, and so sad when I see it start to shrivel.
Well,
activation is a great word.
Activation, yeah.
Before we go, because I guess one is always in a specific moment, but it feels that the world is in a very specific moment right now. And Katy, since you brought up the words joy and fun, and I will add hope to that, I'm interested in knowing
we
how
got to add love too.
And love. This panel feels good. I'm wondering how all of you are doing that in your own lives, and what we perhaps can bring to it.
Let me start, because it's so late here. I try to bring love and help to people in my continent, especially in my country that we call the invisible, the poorest of the poorest, no one cares about. And I've been doing this since 2007. And what I realized throughout the year is that at the end of the day, those young women, those young adolescent girls that I start helping, they are the one helping me today to get the wisdom that I have today to be where I am today. Because don't fool yourself. When you're helping somebody, the person help you more. You create something by giving the power to the person to take lead in its whole life. People have been trying to help us in Africa for so many years, telling us what we gotta do. Like we don't have any brain to think. We don't know our own problems. African women are this. African women all the time is always about rape. It's all about this. I mean, we have been put in a coffin for so long that the world that is gonna come after COVID-19 gonna be a surprise for a lot of people. Because the young kids that I meet in Africa, they blow my mind away. They want peace. They want to participate in the economy of this world. They want to tell people that they are here to stay. So my arts, everything about democracy for me is changing, is giving. You take and you give. You don't give, you don't get. So words is like eggs, they say in my country. Once it falls on the ground, you can piece it back up. So I'm always walking that fine line of finding compromise with people to move and to build coalition, to activate people to move forward. Sorry.
Yeah, I'll go.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, just because it's also similar, I think, to Angélique. I work with a lot of Indigenous youth all around the country. And for me, I just, everything I do, I'm always writing to them. I was writing that one girl in the middle of South Dakota, incredibly remote place. And, when I talk to these young women, I was talking to some young women on Pine Ridge, which is, all the statistics, all the poverty porn, the poorest in the nation, the highest rate of suicide, the highest rate of alcoholism, blah, 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 blah. And, and I talk to these young women, I say, what do you want me to write about? What do you want me to be telling the world? And they don't mention any of that. They mention love. They mention hope. They mention a powerful Lakota girl who uses her ancestors and saves the future. They mention riding a horse. They mention like all these beautiful things in a girl that can speak her language openly, and a girl that can do these powerful things and these absolutely everyday ordinary things. That's what they want to know about. They never once tell them about our poverty, tell them about our rape, tell them about our murder, tell them, not once. It's all about the incredible positive things they're going to do to change the world. So that's what I hold on to.
It is true. Statistics hold us in a hole. I mean, we have too much expert talking about on behalf of everybody. We need to get to know each other. We need to embrace each other's differences. And until we do that, we will be always fooled by the one that have the power, that want us divided for them to exist. And for me, one thing about democracy, we need to get money out of power. We need to get money out of voting system. It has to be about things that we give. We give a letter to somebody that wants to become a president of a country. This is this, tack. This is what we want you to do. That's what we're sending you there. And there's no money to be spent to do any campaign around the country.
Yeah.
So speaking of power, I mentioned before that one of the things that I think a lot about is people who've been in power for a long time, getting out of those positions, and and particularly white people, white ladies in the arts like me, like people moving around, like cycling through and not staying in those positions very long. So one of the things that's bringing me joy right now, I'm here in Manchester, England for the year, and I'm working with the local government, and sort of we got the opportunity to use legislative theater to influence this 5-year homelessness prevention strategy with the local government right before COVID hit. And so we're doing this facilitator training with folks who've never been Theater of the Oppressed facilitators, but are leaders in their communities and love the arts, and we're doing it over Zoom. And I feel like there's this opportunity right now in this very difficult time to kind of like secretly, with like covert, like power shifting, and when we all come back, it's like, oops, different people in charge. I don't know what happened. So that is bringing me a lot of joy.
Oopsie.
Right. Richard, can you close us out?
Sure. It's really interesting because for the first time in my life, I mean, I always go to poetry when something happens personally or publicly or any kind of tragedy, and I haven't been able to write about COVID because it's this constantly moving target. I finally nailed a poem down yesterday, hopefully, but it took me a while. But I guess I'm going to really just sort of think out loud here. I guess I've always doubted, why am I writing a poem? Right? Why am I not just, in a homeless shelter, building a house for somebody? And I think what this process has taught me, not that we all value art, and I totally get that. That's kind of what I do best. I'm a horrible, like, sort of picket sign holder. I'm not that person, but I my power is words. But I'm just feeling through this that I need to be more present in some ways. I'm not going to say I'm not, going to open up like, a new center for this or the other, but be more hands-on. And I think I'm learning. Again, it's sort of like what we're all saying, what you were saying, Angélique, like witnessing these injustices that were sort of, even blind. I mean, sort of like so casually in front of our eyes, and now we're just saying, "Oh my God, this is a mile deep and a mile wide, right?" And what can I do in my community besides write poetry, or I should say, in addition to? And I think that's what I'm trying to negotiate now, like how to be more present with my art, but also just as Richard Blanco, a human being in the world, and just not taking credit for things, for my writing or for whatever. So I think that's where this is what this whole space has taught me recently.
Well, I want to thank all of you. I feel that we could continue for several more hours, but I'm also very conscious of the fact that it is well past some folks' bedtime on the panel. So thank you. Thank you so much, Angélique Kidjo, Larissa FastHorse, Katy Rubin, and Richard Blanco. I feel fired up and full of hope, and I hope you do too.
Yes.
Thank you.
But I don't know if I'm going to fall asleep, though. You all wired me up. My husband gonna sleep somewhere else.